She booked a quiet weekend in a cabin, but her billionaire boss was there and never let her go. Hey there! Welcome back to Stories TH, where we bring you stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat. If you're in the mood for something a little unexpected today, you've come to the right place. Imagine this. You've booked a peaceful weekend getaway in a remote cabin, just to unwind and escape from it all. But guess who's already there? Your billionaire boss. And no, he's not leaving anytime soon. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this story unfolds. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Stories TH, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. I love hearing from you. So, grab a drink, get comfy, and let's get into this crazy adventure together. The unexpected twist of a quiet weekend. Julia had been planning for months. She was exhausted, worn thin by the constant rush of deadlines, meetings, and the never-ending stream of emails. The idea of a quiet weekend in a cozy cabin surrounded by nothing but snow-covered trees and the soft sounds of nature had become her escape. No work, no stress, and definitely no Ethan Pierce. She had been looking forward to this for so long that she could almost feel the calm of the weekend already. The plan was simple: unwind, recharge, and let go of everything that tied her to the bustling city. Her boots crunched on the fresh snow as she stepped onto the wooden porch of the cabin, her breath visible in the crisp air. She wrapped her arms tighter around her coat, the cold biting at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. The mountains stood tall around her, quiet and majestic, their peaks covered in a blanket of white. She had been driving for hours, and despite the peaceful setting, there was a sense of anticipation building in her. She'd booked this cabin months ago, desperate to get away from everything. There would be no emails, no meetings, and no Ethan. Ethan Pierce, the brilliant but distant CEO of the marketing firm she worked at. He was a man of perfection, of power, and most of all, he was the last person she wanted to run into. As Julia reached for the door handle, she hesitated for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. The door creaked open before she even had the chance to knock, and her stomach dropped. There, standing in the doorway with a steaming mug in his hand, was Ethan. "Ethan?" she managed to say, her voice sounding weak even to her own ears. He blinked, clearly as shocked as she was. "Julia, what are you doing here?" The words caught in her throat. I booked this cabin, a month ago, through the company's travel portal." Ethan glanced down at his mug, then back at her. "I booked it through my personal assistant. Same weekend." Julia's heart sank as she processed what he said. A double booking. Perfect. She felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest, but she forced it down. What could she do? It wasn't his fault. It was just bad luck. The snow began to fall heavier now, the wind picking up, pushing the snow in thick sheets. Ethan stepped aside, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if assessing the situation. "You should come in. The storm's getting worse." Julia hesitated, standing on the porch, the wind biting at her exposed skin. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to be trapped in a cabin with her CEO, the very man she had tried so hard to avoid. But the storm was getting worse, and she couldn't just stand out in the cold. Reluctantly, she stepped inside, dragging her suitcase behind her. As soon as the door closed behind her, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket. The scent of burning pine filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of coffee. The room was rustic yet elegant, decorated with exposed wood beams and soft rugs. Books were stacked neatly beside a worn leather armchair by the fireplace, which crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Ethan placed the mug on the counter and turned to face her. "We'll call the booking office in the morning. I'll take the guest room upstairs. You can take the one near the kitchen." Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. What else could she say? There was nothing else to be done. The storm had trapped them both here, and there was no way around it. She rolled her suitcase toward the hallway, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her mind was spinning. Why was he here? Of all the weekends, why this one? and why did it have to be him? The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and for a moment Julia just stood there, staring at the storm. Ethan didn't seem bothered by the blizzard. He stood by the fire, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. "Did you come here to escape the chaos too?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. For a split second, she saw something different in them, something that wasn't the cold, controlled CEO she knew, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I guess we both needed some peace," he said softly. Julia nodded, unsure how to respond. The silence between them felt heavy, but she couldn't bring herself to break it. Instead, she stepped into the small room she had been assigned, her mind still racing. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the quiet felt almost deafening. She sat on the edge of the bed, unpacking her things mechanically, trying to ignore the confusion swirling inside her. Why was he here? What was going on between them? Was this just an awkward mistake, or was there something more to it? For now, she needed to focus on the quiet, on the stillness that had brought her here. But it was hard to shake the feeling that maybe this weekend would turn out to be more than she ever expected, and not in the way she thought. The unlikely connection. Julia awoke the next morning to the sound of the wind howling outside, louder than before. It wasn't just the storm, it was the strange feeling that had settled into the pit of her stomach. The quiet weekend she had envisioned was already slipping away, and it wasn't just because of the weather. It was Ethan. She sat up slowly, the blankets feeling heavier than usual. The warmth of the fire had faded, and now the chill of the room settled into her bones. Her phone was dead, the battery drained from the long drive up. She glanced over at the small window. The snow piled high, swallowing the view of the world beyond. She was trapped, and so was he. She could hear the faint sound of movement from the kitchen, and instinctively, her feet hit the cold floor, her mind already on autopilot. Despite her discomfort, she found herself walking toward the main room where Ethan was. There was something about being around him that made her feel both unsettled and oddly intrigued. As she stepped into the living room, she found Ethan at the counter, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. His casual appearance, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, was a far cry from the sharp suits he wore in the office. It made him seem almost normal. "Morning," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Ethan turned and gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Morning, Julia. Coffee?" She nodded, appreciating the gesture. As she sat at the small wooden table, he poured 2 mugs, handing one to her. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was like they were both waiting for the other to say something, but neither of them knew where to begin. "So," Julia started, hoping to break the tension. "I guess we're stuck here for the weekend." Ethan gave a small chuckle, his lips barely curling at the corners. "Looks like it. The road's completely covered in snow. No way out until the plows clear it." Julia took a sip of the coffee, trying to warm her body from the inside out. It was good, better than she expected from a man who usually dealt with spreadsheets and presentations, not brewing coffee. She looked out the window, the snow still falling in thick, heavy flakes. "Well, I suppose we'll just have to make the best of it. A couple of days in the middle of nowhere, no distractions. It's almost like a forced retreat." Ethan didn't respond right away, but she noticed him watching her, his gaze thoughtful. "You seem like someone who's always on the go. It must be nice to have some peace and quiet." Julia felt a pang in her chest. Was he talking about her life in the office? The constant rush, the pressure to perform? She wasn't sure she could talk to him about that. Not here, not now. Instead, she tried to change the subject. "What about you? Why are you here? I mean, other than the obvious double booking?" Ethan seemed to stiffen for a second, but then his shoulders relaxed. "I used to come here with my family, before things got complicated." Julia's curiosity was piqued. She'd never really thought about Ethan's personal life. He was always the stoic CEO, always polished, always perfect. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, he seemed different. "Complicated how?" Ethan took a deep breath, staring into his mug. Family business stuff. My father's health took a turn, and my brother, well, let's just say it didn't help. Coming up here was the only time we could get away from it all. Julia could feel the shift in the air, like a change in the weather that came out of nowhere. She wasn't sure if she was intruding, but it was hard to ignore the vulnerability that seemed to hang around him. It was hard to imagine Ethan, the strong, imposing CEO, having such a difficult family situation. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sounds hard." He nodded, his face unreadable. "It was. It still is. But I don't talk about it much. I'm not one to air my dirty laundry." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the background, the wind howling outside, but inside, everything was still. Julia cleared her throat, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Well, I'm glad you're here. I guess. I mean, we'll be fine, right?" Ethan turned to look at her, his gaze softer now. "Yeah, we'll be fine." They both sat there, nursing their coffee, unsure of what came next. The tension between them had eased, but there was still something unspoken, something lingering just beneath the surface. Then, as if to break the silence, Julia asked, "So, what do we do now? The storm's not going to stop anytime soon." Ethan thought for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "I don't know. We could play a game. I'm not above a little competition." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You? Play a game?" Ethan smirked. "What? You think I'm all business and no play?" She couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and free. "I guess we'll see. I'm pretty competitive myself." He leaned back in his chair, the briefest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "We'll see who wins then." It was the first real moment of ease between them. For the first time that weekend, Julia felt like maybe, just maybe, this could turn into something other than an awkward, forced escape, but she wasn't sure yet if she was ready to let her guard down completely. Ethan Pierce wasn't someone who could be easily figured out, and she wasn't about to start assuming she knew him. Not yet. A shift in the air. The storm raged on throughout the morning, its howling winds rattling the windows, but the air inside the cabin had shifted. What began as an uncomfortable, awkward situation between Julia and Ethan was slowly becoming something else. There was still tension between them, but it was quieter, more subtle, as if a door had cracked open between two people who were both trying to navigate uncharted territory. Ethan had suggested they play a game, something simple to pass the time, and to Julia's surprise, it had been an excellent idea. They dug through a small closet in the corner of the cabin and pulled out a box of Scrabble. Ethan's eyebrow raised when he saw it, but Julia just shrugged. "I warned you," she said, setting the board up on the coffee table. "I'm competitive." He chuckled, his usual cool demeanor slipping just slightly. "I can tell. This should be interesting." They began playing, each taking their turns and strategically placing tiles on the board. The conversation flowed easily between them as they played, and for the first time that weekend, it felt like they were just two people hanging out. Nothing more, nothing less. Ethan wasn't the intimidating CEO who ruled the company with an iron fist, and Julia wasn't the quiet employee who kept her head down. They were just two people trying to make the best of a weird situation. As the game progressed, they began to relax. Julia couldn't help but smile as Ethan's competitive side came out, and she enjoyed seeing him, for once, not in control of everything. It was funny how something as simple as a game could break the ice. By the time they were halfway through the second round, Julia had won the first game, and Ethan, though a good sport, was already eyeing his next opportunity to win. "You're not going to let me win, are you?" Julia teased, taking another turn. Ethan looked at her, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Let you win? I don't think so. I'm just letting you enjoy your victory for now." Julia smirked. "Enjoy it while you can. I'm not going easy on you in the next round." They continued, the minutes slipping away unnoticed as the game played on. For a while, the storm outside seemed like a distant memory. The storm in the cabin had become something much more subtle. the quiet tension, the unspoken thoughts hanging between them. After the second game ended, Julia leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms above her head. "You're good, I'll give you that," she said, laughing a little. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he was staring into the fire, the flickering light casting shadows over his face. Julia followed his gaze, her thoughts wandering to places she wasn't ready to visit. The quiet was heavier now, filled with the weight of the things they had yet to say to each other. "You know," Ethan started, his voice low, "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect this weekend to turn into—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Whatever this is." Julia turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "What did you expect?" He chuckled softly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "I don't know. I figured it would just be a few days of isolation. I didn't think I'd be spending it with you." Julia's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his tone that made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't an insult, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something deeper. She wasn't sure if he was just speaking from a place of frustration, or if he was revealing more than he intended. "Well," she said carefully, "this is definitely not how I imagined it either. I wasn't exactly planning on being trapped in a cabin with my boss." Ethan's gaze shifted toward her, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Yeah, I get that. But I'm glad it's you. I think it would have been a lot worse if I was here alone." Julia's breath caught slightly, the warmth of his words surprising her. She hadn't expected any of this. It wasn't just the storm that had trapped them. It was the moments like this, the unexpected ones, that made her question everything she thought she knew about Ethan Pierce. The conversation turned to lighter topics. They talked about their favorite books, movies, and their travels. The storm outside continued its furious onslaught, but inside the cabin, the only sound was their voices and the occasional pop from the fire. Julia found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, forgetting for a moment that Ethan was the CEO of the company she worked for. In that moment, he wasn't her boss. He was just Ethan, the man sitting across from her, sharing a moment in time that neither of them had planned. Eventually, the conversation turned quieter, and Ethan leaned back, his eyes still focused on the fire. Julia noticed a subtle shift in his posture, as if he was letting go of the hard edges he usually carried around. There was something vulnerable in the way he held himself now, something that made Julia look at him in a new light. "You never answered my question," Julia said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. "What question?" "Why this cabin?" she asked. "Why did you really come here?" He paused, and for a moment, Julia thought he might avoid answering. But then he sighed, looking down at his hands. "I came here to get away from everything. The pressure, the responsibilities. Everything." He looked up, his gaze steady. "And I guess I didn't expect to feel anything. I didn't expect to connect with anyone. But now, I'm not sure anymore." Julia felt her chest tighten. He wasn't saying anything outright, but she could feel the weight of his words. It was as if the walls around him were slowly starting to crack, just a little. And for the first time in their brief time together, Julia saw Ethan Pierce for who he really was. Not just the billionaire CEO, but a man trying to find his way in a world that had a way of swallowing him whole. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt like she was starting to understand him. A moment of clarity. The fire crackled, casting a soft glow across the room. Julia sat back in her chair, her mind racing after Ethan's unexpected words. He had let his guard down, just a little, and for the first time, she felt like she was seeing a side of him that no one else got to see. Ethan Pierce, the man who ran a multi-million-dollar company, was just human. It was almost too much to process. She wasn't used to seeing him like this, vulnerable and unsure. For so long, he had been the epitome of power and control. But in that moment, he was just a man sitting in a cabin, trapped by a storm, and sharing pieces of himself she never thought she'd get to see. Julia took a slow breath, trying to gather her thoughts. The world outside was a blur of white snow, but inside, it was as if time had slowed down. She could feel the weight of their conversation, the unspoken truths hanging in the air. Neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge it, but the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer just about being trapped together in a cabin. It was about the connection that was quietly building between them. "Ethan," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to pry earlier. About your family. I didn't know." He turned toward her, the lines of tension around his eyes softening just slightly. "It's fine. It's just not something I talk about much." Julia nodded. She could understand that. There were things in her own life that she kept hidden, things she wasn't ready to share. But right now, in this cabin with the storm raging outside, something felt different. She wasn't just a silent employee trying to do her job. She was a person, and Ethan, despite being her boss, was starting to feel like someone she could talk to. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything still between them, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. It felt manageable. They had broken through something, a small barrier, and it was a start. "So, what do we do now?" Julia finally asked, her voice lighter than before. Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Well, there's still a lot of snow outside. No way we're getting out of here anytime soon. How about we just ride it out and see where this goes?" It was the first time he had said anything that didn't feel calculated, like everything was planned out. His words were simple, casual, and for a moment Julia forgot he was the CEO of a huge company. He was just Ethan, someone she was starting to feel an undeniable pull toward. "Well, I guess I could get used to the idea of spending more time here," Julia said, trying to keep the mood light. "It's not the worst place to be stuck in." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her comment. "You're really going to let a little snow stop you? I thought you were the type who liked a challenge." Julia laughed, and it felt good. It had been a while since she had laughed like this, genuinely and without any weight behind it. "I'm competitive, but there's a difference between playing Scrabble and trying to figure out how to get out of a snowstorm." "You think we can't handle it?" Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, his expression challenging. Julia smirked. "I'm just saying, you're the CEO. You're supposed to know how to fix things." Ethan chuckled, a real laugh this time, the kind she didn't expect from him. "I don't have a manual for snowstorms in my office." It felt like the tension was dissolving in real time, piece by piece. Julia realized just how much she had built up walls around herself over the years, how much she had been afraid to let anyone see the parts of her that didn't fit into the corporate world. But now, with Ethan, it was different. She wasn't just her job. She wasn't just a cog in the machine. And Ethan, he wasn't just the untouchable CEO anymore. "Honestly," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, "this whole situation, it's not what I expected. I don't think either of us were planning on being here together. But now that we are, I'm starting to see it's not so bad." Julia's heart skipped a beat. There it was, again, an honesty she hadn't expected. Ethan wasn't just the guy who made tough decisions in the boardroom. He was someone who could be honest about his feelings, even if they weren't fully formed. It was a side of him she was slowly coming to appreciate. "Yeah, well," Julia replied, her voice softer now, "maybe it's not so bad after all." Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the world outside disappeared. They were just two people, sharing a space and time that neither of them had planned for. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was a quiet that neither of them had expected. A shift had happened between them, subtle, but real. What started as an awkward mistake, being trapped together in the middle of nowhere, was slowly becoming something else. Something that couldn't be ignored. Julia took a deep breath, her eyes not leaving his. She didn't know what this was yet, or where it would go, but something inside her told her that this weekend, in this cabin, was going to change everything. She couldn't explain it, but she was beginning to realize that sometimes the things we try to avoid are the very things we need most. The storm within. The storm outside continued to rage, but the tension in the cabin had transformed. What had once been an awkward, uncomfortable situation was now evolving into something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. Julia could feel it, this invisible pull between her and Ethan, something that was undeniably there, despite the circumstances. As they continued to chat and relax, time seemed to stretch. The hours blurred together, with the only sounds being the crackling fire and their occasional laughter. Ethan's usual stiffness had softened, and for the first time, Julia saw him as something more than the CEO. He was a man complex, vulnerable, and real. And there was something about his vulnerability that made her feel both protective and intrigued. Sitting by the fire, their chairs closer than before, Julia found herself studying him in a way she never had. His usually sharp features were softer now, the harshness in his expression gone. He looked human, just like her. For the first time in a long time, Julia felt herself opening up, letting her guard slip. It wasn't just the isolation of being stuck in a cabin together. It was the fact that Ethan wasn't who she had built him up to be in her mind. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO. He wasn't the cold, distant figure she saw in the office. He was someone else entirely, and that was both thrilling and terrifying. "So what's next?" Julia asked, trying to sound casual. She was feeling the pull between them more now, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. "We've done the game, the small talk. What else is there to do?" Ethan chuckled, his gaze flickering to her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Well, we could go out in the snow, but I don't think either of us is brave enough for that." Julia laughed, a real full-bodied laugh that felt freeing. "Yeah, I don't think I'm prepared to face a snowstorm just yet. Maybe we'll have to make do with what we've got in here." "Not a bad idea," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, his tone lighter than before. He looked over at her, his eyes tracing her features. "You know, for someone who seems so guarded in the office, you're actually pretty easy to talk to." Julia felt the heat rise in her cheeks at his compliment, but she didn't shy away from it. "I guess I'm more relaxed when I'm not working. Besides, I'm not here to be a robot." The words hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time, Julia allowed herself to relax completely. They weren't just two colleagues stuck in a cabin anymore. There was something more, something that felt real and raw, but it scared her. It terrified her to let herself be this open with someone who was so far outside the realm of her usual life. She had always been careful, always kept her distance, but something about Ethan made it hard to hold back. Ethan seemed to sense her shift, and he took a deep breath, his voice quieter. "You know, I didn't think much of this place when I booked it. I thought it would be just a way to escape everything work, family, responsibilities, but now, I'm not sure." Julia's eyes flickered toward him, sensing the underlying meaning behind his words. She wanted to ask more, to push him for details, but part of her wasn't ready for that. Not yet. "Yeah, I get that," Julia said, her voice soft. "I didn't expect much either. I thought it would be a quick getaway, a chance to breathe, but I'm starting to think it's not just the storm outside that's keeping us here." Ethan looked at her, his gaze intense. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Julia began slowly, her voice low, "that maybe this weekend, this whole situation, it's making us face things we've been avoiding, things we're not ready to deal with." The words hit the air with weight, and Julia immediately felt the tension in the room grow. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her wonder if he understood exactly what she meant. He looked at her, his lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment they just stared at each other, the silence thick between them. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Maybe you're right." Julia's heart raced at his words. She wasn't sure if they were talking about the storm anymore, or if they were talking about the storm that had been brewing between them since they arrived at the cabin. She wasn't sure if either of them was ready to confront it, but she knew they had no choice. The moment had arrived, and it was impossible to ignore. Without thinking, Julia stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the thick snow that still blanketed the world outside. The storm was still fierce, relentless, but the beauty of the snow, its quiet, calming presence, was undeniable. Ethan stood up too, walking over to her. The air between them was charged now, and the simple act of standing so close to him made her pulse quicken. He was taller than she remembered, and there was a quiet strength in the way he moved. She could feel the heat of his body so close to hers, and yet the space between them was still vast, like an invisible wall neither of them knew how to cross. "I don't want to leave here," she said softly, not looking at him but feeling his presence like a weight in the room. "Not yet." Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough so that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck. His hand brushed against hers, and she froze. "I don't want to leave either," he said, his voice barely a whisper. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if they were both waiting for the other to make the first move. But neither of them knew what to do next. The storm outside was still fierce, but inside, something had shifted, something that neither of them could deny any longer. The unspoken understanding. The air between Julia and Ethan was thick with unspoken words, the space between them charged with something neither of them was ready to name. The storm outside continued its fury, but inside the cabin, time seemed to slow down. Every second felt like it carried weight, like it was leading them somewhere, but neither knew exactly where that was. Julia stood by the window, her back to Ethan, her thoughts swirling. She could feel him there, close but not touching, and her mind raced. The warmth of his breath, the subtle shift in his presence, sent waves of heat through her body. She had never been so aware of someone before, never had someone's mere presence affected her like this. And it terrified her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You're right, he said, his words surprising her. "This whole weekend it's making us face things we've been avoiding." Julia turned to look at him, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. He wasn't just talking about the storm. He was talking about them. About the tension that had been building, the quiet understanding they had shared since the moment they realized they were stuck together. She swallowed hard, her thoughts spinning. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is," she confessed, her voice shaky. "I'm not even sure I know what it is." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The space between them was shrinking, but it still felt like a chasm, filled with things they weren't yet brave enough to say. His gaze softened, and for the first time Julia saw him as more than just the cold, distant CEO. He was a man, just like her, struggling to navigate the same complexities of life, relationships, and emotions. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly, his voice low, "but I know I don't want to pretend anymore. Not with you." Julia's heart skipped a beat. The words hit her like a wave, flooding her with emotions she didn't know how to process. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, building walls to protect herself, and now, standing here in this cabin, surrounded by the storm, she was beginning to wonder if maybe it was time to let those walls come down. "You don't have to pretend with me either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took another step toward her, his hand reaching out just inches from hers. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else too, something real, something they could no longer deny. It was a fragile understanding, a connection that neither of them had anticipated but now couldn't ignore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, locked in an unspoken conversation, the weight of their shared silence heavier than any words could be. The wind howled outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing between them. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer than before. "Julia, I didn't plan for this. For you. But now, I can't imagine this weekend without you in it." Julia's breath caught in her throat. His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. He wasn't just saying he wanted to spend time with her. He was saying something deeper, something that spoke to the heart of what they had been building, without either of them truly realizing it. "I didn't plan for this either," she admitted, her eyes meeting his. "But I'm starting to think maybe I'm glad it happened." Ethan's hand, which had been hovering just inches from hers, finally made contact. His fingers brushed against hers gently, sending a shock of warmth through her. It was a simple touch, but it was enough to make Julia's heart race. She had spent so long keeping her distance from people, but in this moment, with Ethan standing in front of her, everything felt different. For the first time, she didn't want to run. She didn't want to hide. She wanted to be here, in this moment, with him. Slowly, almost tentatively, Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Julia's breath caught as he reached out to touch her face, his fingers grazing her cheek gently. It was as if he was testing the waters, unsure of how far to go, but determined to be there. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, savoring the feel of his touch, the warmth radiating from him. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the intensity in his gaze. The storm outside had nothing on the storm inside the cabin. It wasn't just the snow that kept them there. It was this connection, the one that neither of them had anticipated, but both felt now. Ethan leaned in slowly, and Julia's heart began to race. She wasn't sure what was happening, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside could wait. They had finally found something real in the middle of a snowstorm. Their lips met in a soft kiss, tentative at first, as if they were both unsure of what came next. But as the kiss deepened, everything else fell away. The cold, the storm, the uncertainty. It was just them, here, together, in a way neither of them had imagined when they first arrived. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. Julia's heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel the warmth of Ethan's presence surrounding her. "I don't know what this is, Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaky. "But I don't want to walk away from it." Ethan smiled, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. "Neither do I, Julia. Neither do I." And in that moment, with the storm still raging outside, they both knew something had shifted. They were no longer just two people stuck in a cabin. They were two people who had found something real, something worth fighting for. The calm. After the storm, the world outside remained trapped in a white abyss, the snow still falling heavily. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The storm that had trapped Julia and Ethan together seemed to have cleared in its own way. No longer were they just two strangers caught in an inconvenient situation. They had become something more, something unspoken yet undeniable. Julia sat on the couch, her eyes flickering to the window every so often, as if the sight of the storm would help her process what had just happened. Her mind was racing. What had just changed between her and Ethan? The connection between them was no longer something she could ignore, but the reality of the outside world was still there, waiting to intrude. The kiss had been real, raw, and passionate. But now what? Ethan was standing by the fire, a soft smile on his lips, his back to her. The way he stood, relaxed, almost casual, was a stark contrast to the tightly wound CEO she was used to. He seemed different, softer, as though the weight of the world had been lifted just a little. But that didn't mean the world had stopped turning. It was only a temporary reprieve, and they both knew it. Finally, Ethan turned to face her. His eyes met hers, and there was no hiding the raw honesty in his gaze. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "But I'm not running from it, Julia. Not anymore." Julia's heart skipped a beat. His words were simple, but they felt like a declaration. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment it didn't matter. The storm outside had brought them together, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She stood up, crossing the room toward him, her feet moving of their own accord. She didn't have a plan. She wasn't sure what came next, but she didn't want to hide anymore. She wanted to face whatever this was, whatever they were head on. "I don't want to run either," she whispered, her hand reaching out toward him. She could feel the warmth of his body before her fingers even touched his arm. The touch was simple, but it grounded her. This was real. He was real. Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers, pulling her closer. "I don't have the answers, Julia. I don't even know what happens after this weekend, but I know I don't want to walk away from this." She nodded, her throat tightening as she tried to find the right words. She had always been cautious, careful with her heart. But here, with Ethan, everything felt different. For the first time, she felt like she could let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she was willing to walk it with him. "I'm not ready to let go either," she said softly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to see where this goes." Ethan's face softened, and he leaned down slightly, bringing his lips closer to her ear. "Neither do I. But for once, I'm okay with that." They stood there in the quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of the wind outside. It was a peaceful moment, a brief pause in time, but Julia felt like she was seeing Ethan for the first time. He wasn't the untouchable CEO anymore. He was just a man, with flaws and insecurities, just like her. And in this space, they were both allowed to be imperfect. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside them had passed, leaving something calmer, something real. They didn't have all the answers, but they had this moment, and for now, it was enough. Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and they both moved toward the window. The snow had finally started to lighten, the flurry of white slowly easing as if the world was taking a deep breath. For the first time that weekend, Julia felt a sense of peace settle over her. "We'll figure this out," Ethan said, his voice low, his words filled with determination. "One step at a time." Julia smiled, her heart light despite the uncertainty of what was to come. It wasn't the perfect ending, and it wasn't a fairy tale, but it was theirs. It was real. And in this moment, that was enough. The storm outside may have been slowly coming to an end, but the journey they were about to embark on was only just beginning. The world beyond the cabin would eventually call them back, with all its responsibilities and expectations. But for now, all that mattered was the quiet between them. They had found something in each other, something unexpected, something genuine, and that was worth holding on to. As they stood side by the window, watching the last of the snowflakes fall, Julia felt a sense of calm wash over her. The storm might have trapped them here, but it had also led them to this new beginning, this chance to explore what was between them. And for the first time, Julia felt the weight of the world lift, just a little. Beyond the cabin, the storm outside had finally quieted to a gentle snowfall. But inside the cabin, a new kind of stillness had settled. Julia and Ethan had spent the rest of the day in relative silence, their conversations now laced with a deeper understanding, something unspoken but tangible. Their connection was undeniable, and as the evening crept in, both of them found themselves lost in thoughts that they weren't quite ready to articulate yet. Julia sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick, cozy blanket, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. The soft light of the dying fire flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across the room. Ethan had taken a seat across from her, his posture relaxed, but his eyes still carrying the weight of the past few hours. It was clear that the storm had changed something between them, but neither knew exactly how to move forward. After a few moments, Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "So, what now?" Julia met his gaze, unsure how to answer. The question wasn't just about the weekend. It wasn't just about being trapped in this cabin. It was about everything that had transpired between them. The quiet, the unspoken moments, the kiss, and the strange new feelings that had bubbled up since they first walked through the door. "I don't know," she admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I guess we just take it one step at a time." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving hers. Yeah, I like that idea. One step at a time. For a long moment, the two of them just sat there, the weight of the words lingering in the air. It was strange how something as simple as a snowstorm could have brought them together in ways neither of them had expected. But now, with the world outside calmer and their time together dwindling, the question loomed. Could they take this connection beyond the cabin? Could it survive when the storm was over? Julia swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the pressure of the unknown. What happens when the snow clears? When we go back to the city and everything is back to normal? Ethan's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. I don't know, but I'd like to find out. I'm not ready to let go of this, Julia. Not yet. Her heart fluttered in her chest. She could feel the sincerity in his words, and for the first time, a real sense of possibility blossomed inside her. There was something about the way he looked at her, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes, that made her want to believe in something more. In a world where everything felt uncertain and driven by external pressures, this moment with him felt like an anchor. It was real, and for once, she didn't feel like she needed to run from it. I'm not ready either, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if admitting it out loud made it all the more real. But I'm scared, Ethan. Ethan leaned forward, his face earnest, the soft light of the fire flickering in his eyes. I know. I am too. But I've spent so much of my life running from things, my feelings, my responsibilities, the truth about who I am. I don't want to keep running anymore. Not from you. Her heart skipped a beat at his words. Ethan had always been the figurehead of control, the man everyone admired from afar, the one with the unshakable confidence. But now, here he was, opening up to her in a way that made everything feel so much more complicated, but also so much more real. I never thought I'd be here, she said quietly, almost to herself. I never thought I'd let someone in like this. Ethan smiled softly, his eyes warm. Maybe that's the point, Julia. Maybe we're both here because we've spent too long keeping walls up. Maybe it's time to see what happens when we start taking them down. Julia felt a mixture of hope and fear, the two emotions swirling together inside her. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about her job or her future, or all the things that had always seemed so important. She was thinking about right now, about the connection between her and Ethan, about the quiet moments that had brought them closer. I don't know what this is yet, she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions inside her. But I think it's something worth exploring. Ethan's smile deepened, and he stood up slowly, crossing the room to sit beside her. The space between them was no longer filled with tension, but with something else, something quieter, more meaningful. He reached out and took her hand gently in his fingers warm against her skin. I'm glad you're willing to see where it goes, he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. Julia looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of the moment. There was still so much uncertainty, so much left unsaid, but in this space, with the storm finally quieting outside and the fire flickering in the background, she felt something shift. The walls she had carefully constructed around herself, the walls that had always kept her safe, were starting to crumble. And for once, she didn't mind. I think we'll figure it out, she said softly, her gaze lifting to meet his. Together. Ethan nodded, his thumb brushing gently over the back of her hand. Together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Julia allowed herself to believe in something beyond the walls of her carefully constructed life. In this moment, she wasn't just a worker, a quiet employee trying to stay out of the spotlight. She was just Julia, standing beside Ethan, the man who had somehow made her see that maybe, just maybe, the storm outside wasn't the only one that could change everything. The snow may have stopped falling, but the journey between them had only just begun. The tension of real life. The morning after the storm passed was eerily quiet. The snow had tapered off, leaving the world outside a pristine white landscape. The sun, low in the sky, cast a soft golden glow through the cabin windows, illuminating the dusting of snow that still clung to the trees outside. Inside, the cabin was warm and cozy, the fire from the night before reduced to embers, but there was still a quiet, lingering sense of something that had shifted between Julia and Ethan. They had spent the previous evening talking, sharing more than they ever had before. The walls, those carefully constructed barriers that they had each built around their lives, seemed to have crumbled. But now, with the storm gone and the outside world waiting, Julia couldn't help but wonder where they stood. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out the window. The snow-covered world outside seemed to mock her thoughts, so serene, so still. But everything inside her was anything but still. She could feel the weight of the decisions ahead, the pressure of returning to the real world, where things were more complicated than they appeared in this cabin. Ethan's presence beside her felt real, grounded, but she was unsure how to move forward from here. Ethan came up behind her, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. "You okay?" His voice, low and calm, broke her from her thoughts. Julia turned, meeting his gaze. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he was trying to figure out what was going on behind her eyes, but he wasn't pushing. He was just present. "I'm not sure," she said honestly, her voice a little strained. "This weekend has been different. I just don't know how to go back to reality after this. To go back to him," she added quietly, referring to her demanding boss, the very life that had pushed her to seek refuge here. Ethan moved to sit beside her, his presence warm and reassuring. "You don't have to go back to anything if you don't want to. You're not the same person who came up here. Maybe you've changed in ways you didn't expect." Julia let out a soft breath. "I've been trying to escape from everything: work, the expectations, the noise. But now I'm stuck between two worlds, the one I ran from, and the one I've built here with you." His gaze softened, and he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose. We're just figuring this out together, right?" Julia nodded, but deep down the tension was still there. It was one thing to explore this connection here in the quiet, isolated cabin, where the storm kept the world at bay. It was another thing entirely to take what had started here and carry it back into the chaos of their everyday lives. Ethan's voice pulled her from her thoughts again. "Whatever happens, Julia, I want you to know that I'm not walking away. I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I'm not leaving you to figure it out alone." The sincerity in his words struck her deeply. She knew he meant it. He wasn't offering empty promises. He wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. He was being real. And for a moment, Julia allowed herself to believe it. But as much as she wanted to, she knew it wasn't that simple. Real life had a way of intruding, of complicating everything. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I've spent so long building walls around myself, protecting myself from everything, from getting hurt, from letting people in. And now it feels like I'm just supposed to trust. Trust that this can be something. Trust that it can survive when we go back to reality." Ethan turned fully toward her, his face serious. "Trust doesn't come easy, Julia. Not for me either. But that's what this weekend has been about: taking a chance. We don't have all the answers, and maybe we won't ever have them. But we can start with this. We can start with trusting that we're both here, right now, and that's enough." Julia looked into his eyes, seeing the same vulnerability in him that she felt. For a fleeting moment, everything felt clear, like the storm had passed not just outside, but inside her as well. She had been running from so many things, avoiding feelings, avoiding situations that could break her. But now, with Ethan here, she felt something shift. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, to feel something more than fear. "I want to believe that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe in this." Ethan smiled softly, his hand still holding hers. "We'll take it slow, one day at a time." The moment between them was broken by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall, reminding them both that time was moving forward. Julia knew they couldn't stay in this cabin forever. They couldn't keep pretending that the world outside didn't exist. But she also knew that, no matter what happened when they returned to the real world, something had changed between them. The connection they had found wasn't temporary. It was real, and that meant something. Ethan's voice was soft, almost like a promise. "Whenever you're ready, Julia, we'll face it together." Julia didn't know what would happen when they left this cabin, when they returned to their normal lives, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. And that thought brought more peace than she ever thought possible. For the first time, she let herself believe that, no matter the storms they would face, together they could weather anything. The uncharted territory. The morning was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch on forever, as though the world itself was waiting for something. The sun had risen high enough to start melting the snow that had gathered on the porch, but the sky was still an almost unnatural shade of white. Julia sat at the small dining table, absent-mindedly sipping her coffee, her eyes flickering toward Ethan, who was standing by the window. He hadn't said much this morning, but the weight of their conversation from the previous night hung between them, still raw and uncertain. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a place of crossroads. It was the end of the isolation, the calm before the storm of real life resumed. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen once they stepped back into the chaos of their everyday lives. Would the connection they had forged survive the inevitable distance? Could they take what had begun here and make it something lasting, something real? Ethan turned away from the window and walked toward her, his eyes catching hers. "We should head back soon. The roads are clear now, and the weather's only going to get worse if we wait too long." Julia nodded, feeling a twinge of reluctance. She had known the moment would come. The time to leave this place, to face the world outside, had arrived. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. "I know," she said softly. "But part of me wishes we could just stay here, in this little bubble, where everything's simple." Ethan smiled faintly, sitting down next to her. "I feel that too. But sometimes, we have to face the messiness of life to figure out what really matters." His words hung in the air, and Julia couldn't help but feel a knot form in her stomach. Ethan was right. The real world had a way of intruding, of pushing them back into the roles they were expected to play, into the responsibilities that had always defined them. And while she wanted nothing more than to stay here in this moment, with him, she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. "We'll figure it out, won't we?" Julia asked, her voice uncertain as she turned to him. "When we go back, I mean." Ethan's gaze softened, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "One step at a time. I can't promise that everything will be easy, but I can promise I won't walk away." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside her. She had spent so much of her life focusing on the future, always looking ahead to what needed to be done, never fully allowing herself to be in the present. But with Ethan, it felt different. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was alone in facing the unknown. "I'm not ready to say goodbye to this," Julia whispered, the weight of her words heavier than she had expected. "But I can't stay here forever." Ethan nodded, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand. "We don't have to say goodbye to everything. We just have to figure out how to take this with us, whatever this is." There was an understanding between them now, a shared knowledge that whatever was happening here was important. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. Julia squeezed his hand, finding comfort in the gesture. She didn't need to have everything figured out, not yet. "I think I'm starting to understand," Julia said, her voice softer now. "That I don't need to know everything. I just need to trust the process. Trust that we're on the right path." Ethan smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Exactly. And trust that whatever happens, we'll face it together." It was strange, this feeling of peace amidst the uncertainty. Julia had always been the type to plan, to control everything in her life, but now, with Ethan beside her, she was learning to let go. She didn't need to control everything. She didn't need to know what came next, What mattered was that they were in this together. The next few minutes passed in comfortable silence. They packed up their things, the weight of the impending departure hanging over them, but neither of them spoke of it. Instead, they moved in sync, each action purposeful, like they had done this 1,000 times before. As they pulled the last of their bags together, Julia couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. It was silly, she knew. They weren't really leaving anything behind. They were just stepping back into the real world. But it felt like more than that. It felt like they were leaving behind something they could never get back. The quiet, the simplicity, the connection they had built. But as she stood beside Ethan, ready to leave the cabin, she realized something. The cabin had been the beginning, the first step towards something more, but it didn't have to be the end. They could carry what they had found here with them if they were willing to face whatever came next. Ethan opened the door, and the cool air rushed in. The world outside still covered in snow, but the storm had passed. Julia took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't walking into it alone. As they stepped out into the cold, the world seemed to stretch before them, vast and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Julia didn't feel scared. She felt hopeful. With Ethan by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next, together. New beginnings. The drive back to the city was filled with an odd quiet. The snow had stopped, leaving only traces of its presence on the roads and rooftops. The world outside was washed in a soft glow, the sunlight reflecting off the blanket of white that still clung to the trees. It was beautiful, almost serene, but the beauty of the moment didn't change the reality of what was waiting for them. Julia sat in the passenger seat, her fingers lightly tapping the side of the door, her thoughts drifting. Ethan drove with a quiet intensity, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but there was something different about him now. The man who had once seemed so distant, so unreachable, now felt more like someone she could understand. Maybe it was the vulnerability he had shown her in the cabin, or maybe it was the way they had opened up to each other. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing was the same anymore. The drive felt long, but not in the way it used to. There was no pressure, no ticking clock forcing them to rush. It was as if time itself had slowed down, giving them the space they needed to breathe. And yet, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was about to begin. "Do you think we're crazy?" Julia asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was light, but there was an edge to it, a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Crazy? For what?" "For doing this," she said, motioning between them. "For whatever this is. For letting it happen. For thinking it can work when we go back to everything that's waiting for us." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the road, contemplating her words. The tension that had started to build earlier returned, and Julia's heart thudded in her chest. What if they were rushing into something they weren't ready for? What if everything they had found in the cabin was just the product of a fleeting moment, soon to be lost in the reality of their demanding lives? "We're not crazy, Julia," Ethan finally said, his voice steady. "We're just two people who connected, unexpectedly. We can't predict the future, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't see where it leads." Julia nodded, her hand resting on her lap. His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the doubts swirling in her mind. What if it was all just a temporary escape? Something that wouldn't survive once the pressure of their jobs and lives outside the cabin closed in again? "Do you think we can make it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't help herself. The question had been sitting at the back of her mind since the night before. Ethan glanced over at her, his eyes soft but sure. "I think we can, but only if we're both willing to try." The simplicity of his answer hit her harder than expected. He didn't promise anything. He didn't make sweeping declarations about how they would defy all odds and make this work. He just said they had to be willing to try. And that was enough. In a world that was always looking for certainty, his honesty was refreshing. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of thoughts, each of them contemplating what lay ahead. When they finally reached the city, the towering buildings and busy streets felt like a world apart from the cabin they had left behind. The quiet was gone, replaced by the constant hum of life. Ethan pulled into the parking garage beneath the building where they both worked, the sound of the engine coming to a stop echoing in the otherwise silent space. Julia's heart skipped a beat, the weight of what was about to happen settling in her chest. They had to face reality now. "Well," Ethan said, turning off the engine and looking at her. "Here we are, back to it." Julia didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. She had so many questions, so many doubts, but none of them seemed to matter in this moment. What mattered was that they were here, together, and that they had decided to face the unknown. As they stepped out of the car, Julia looked up at the towering building ahead of them. It felt so different now, almost imposing. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was someone who had allowed herself to feel, to connect, and now she had to figure out how to carry that with her. Ethan walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Whatever happens," he said, "we're in this together. You don't have to do it alone." Julia nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, maybe, or maybe hope. It was hard to tell, but she could feel it, pulsing in her chest. "I'm not ready to walk away from this," she said, her voice steady. "Not from you. Not from whatever this is." Ethan smiled, his hand brushing against hers. "Neither am I." The elevator ride up to their floor was quiet. When the doors opened, the bustling of their coworkers and the familiar hum of office life immediately surrounded them. The contrast between the calm of the cabin and the intensity of the office was jarring, but Julia wasn't afraid anymore. The future was unknown, but she didn't have to face it alone. As she walked into the office, her eyes met Ethan's. There was something different in the way they looked at each other now. A shared understanding, a quiet promise. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The new normal. The office was alive with the usual hustle and bustle, the sound of phones ringing, keyboards clacking, and murmurs of conversations filling the air. But for Julia, everything felt quieter somehow. As she stepped into the familiar space of the office, the weight of what had happened over the weekend settled heavily on her shoulders. The cabin, the snow, and the unexpected moments of connection with Ethan felt like a distant dream now. Reality had set back in, with all its noise and chaos. She could feel the old rhythms of her life trying to pull her back in, the tight grip of responsibility, deadlines, and expectations. But this time, it felt different. Julia walked to her desk, her mind a jumble of thoughts. She couldn't ignore the fact that things had changed between her and Ethan, between her and herself. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that cabin. She had allowed herself to be open, vulnerable, and it felt like something had shifted permanently. The cabin had given her a glimpse of a version of herself she wasn't sure she could access in the office, in the noise of the world. And now, the question was whether she could hold on to that part of herself in the whirlwind of her professional life. She settled into her chair, the familiar click of her keyboard grounding her in the present. The task before her was simple review emails, respond to urgent requests, plan for the week ahead. But as she typed, her mind kept drifting to Ethan, to the conversations they'd shared, the quiet moments that had somehow felt so full of meaning. She hadn't had a chance to talk to him yet. They had parted ways at the parking garage with nothing more than a brief smile and a promise to see each other later. The unspoken understanding between them was still there, but it felt like the office was a boundary they hadn't yet crossed. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan. I know today feels strange, but I'm here if you need to talk. Let's take it one step at a time. Her heart fluttered a little at his message. It was exactly what she needed to hear, but the message also brought with it a reminder of the complexity they now faced. Was it possible to carry what they'd found in the cabin into this world of expectations, professional boundaries, and office politics? Could they really maintain their connection amid the chaos? Julia typed a quick response. Thanks, I'm here too. One step at a time. She hit send and sat back in her chair, a sense of calm washing over her. Ethan's words were a lifeline, a promise that they were in this together. It wasn't a grand gesture or a declaration of love, but it was everything she needed in that moment. They weren't rushing. They weren't pretending. They were simply taking it one step at a time. The day passed in a blur of tasks and meetings. Julia found herself focusing more on the small things, the way her coworkers laughed in the break room, the hum of conversation, the slight clicking of her pen as she jotted down notes. It was the little things that grounded her, reminded her of the life she had before the cabin. But beneath it all, she could still feel the shift. She was starting to see things differently. She was no longer just the quiet employee in the background. She was someone who had found her voice, who had connected with someone in a way she never thought possible. By the time the workday wound down, Julia's thoughts drifted back to Ethan. She hadn't seen him much throughout the day. Their paths had barely crossed, but there was an unspoken bond between them. It was like they were both holding their breath, waiting for the right moment to navigate this new dynamic, this strange new reality. As the office emptied out and the last few employees filed out for the night, Julia grabbed her things and walked toward the elevators. Her phone buzzed again, and her heart skipped as she saw Ethan's name on the screen. "Dinner tonight? I know it's a busy week, but we should talk. Just the two of us." Julia smiled as she read the message. She hadn't expected him to reach out so soon, but the invitation was just what she needed. It wasn't a big dramatic gesture, but it was exactly what they both needed to find their footing in this new reality they were building together. She typed back quickly. "Dinner sounds perfect. I'll meet you after work. Let's take it one step at a time." As the elevator doors slid open, Julia felt a strange sense of peace. The uncertainty was still there, hovering in the background, but it didn't feel as overwhelming. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure where things would go with Ethan. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone. And maybe that was enough for now. The drive to the restaurant felt different than before. The city felt quieter somehow, even with the familiar noise of traffic and people. As she parked and walked into the restaurant, her mind was clear, her heart steady. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Ethan was already at a table when she arrived, looking relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity to him that hadn't been there before. He stood as she approached, giving her a smile that felt like a silent promise. "Hey," he said softly, pulling out the chair for her. "You look like you made it through the day." Julia sat down, the weight of the day finally lifting. "I did. And I'm glad you reached out. I think we needed this." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a softness she hadn't expected. "Yeah, me too. One step at a time, right?" She smiled, feeling a sense of certainty that had been missing all day. For the first time, the future didn't feel so daunting. It felt like something they could face together. "One step at a time," she echoed. And for the first time in a long time, Julia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The road ahead. The soft clink of silverware against porcelain filled the space between Julia and Ethan as they sat across from each other at the cozy restaurant. The warmth of the candlelight flickered in Ethan's eyes, casting shadows that danced on his features, giving him an almost mysterious quality. It was a stark contrast to the controlled environment of their office life, where everything was meticulously planned, every decision scrutinized. Here, in the quiet of the restaurant, with the hum of low conversations around them, Julia felt like they could be anyone, away from the noise of the world. As she took a sip of her wine, her eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them, lost in the conversation they were finally ready to have. "This place is nice," Julia said softly, setting her glass down on the table. "I've passed by it 100 times, but never thought to stop in." Ethan smiled, his gaze steady and warm. "I'm glad you like it. Thought it might be a good spot to reset." Julia nodded, appreciating his effort to create a space where they could talk without the usual distractions. It wasn't just about dinner. It was about taking a step toward understanding what came next for them. "I think we both need a reset," Julia said quietly. The weight of the day, the pressure of what they both knew was inevitable, was starting to catch up with her. She'd been so focused on the uncertainty of the future, but tonight felt different. It felt like she had permission to breathe. Ethan's expression softened, his voice low. "We do. But, whatever happens, I'm not in a rush to figure everything out. We're here, now. That's enough." His words were simple, but they held more weight than they seemed. Julia realized that was exactly what she needed to hear. The pressure of having to know the answers, the feeling that everything needed to fall into place immediately, was overwhelming. But sitting here, with Ethan, she was starting to understand that sometimes, just being present was enough. She let out a breath, letting the tension she hadn't realized she was holding drain away. "I spent so much time avoiding anything that felt real, always hiding behind work, behind responsibilities. I thought I could keep myself busy enough to forget about everything else." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully, his eyes full of understanding. "I think we both did that. I spent so long hiding behind being the CEO, behind all the expectations. But none of that ever helped me figure out what really mattered. Maybe it's time we both stop running from it." Julia's heart thudded in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had been running from vulnerability, from connection. She had kept people at arm's length for so long, never allowing anyone to get too close, afraid that they would see too much, judge too harshly. But now, with Ethan, she was starting to see that it wasn't weakness to allow herself to feel, to be open. It was freedom. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared that I won't be able to keep this up. Scared that everything will fall apart once we go back to the way things were." Ethan reached across the table, his hand gently resting on top of hers. "We don't have to go back to the way things were, Julia. Not unless we want to." Julia's gaze met his, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could believe that. That maybe things didn't have to be the same. She didn't have to be the same. "I don't want to go back," she said softly, the words more certain now. "I don't want to pretend like everything's fine, like I'm not feeling different. I don't want to just go back to what's comfortable if it means losing what we've started here." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, the kind of smile that made her feel like she wasn't alone in her fears. "We don't have to go back to the way things were. We'll figure this out, Julia. We'll do it together." She squeezed his hand gently, finding comfort in the promise he had made, even though they both knew the road ahead would not be easy. They didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to face the unknown together. And for the first time, Julia wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready to embrace it, even with all its uncertainties. The conversation shifted after that, flowing easily between them as they talked about their favorite places to travel, their memories from childhood, and everything that had led them to this point. For the first time, Julia didn't feel the need to hold back. She could be herself, unfiltered, honest, and Ethan seemed to appreciate it. His laughter felt genuine, and his eyes never left her as they spoke. It was as if the world had paused around them, leaving just the two of them in this small, quiet space of understanding. As dinner came to an end, Ethan stood and offered his hand to her. "Shall we go?" Julia smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in days. "I think we should." They walked out of the restaurant together, the cool night air welcoming them back into the city. The streets were busy, full of people coming and going, lost in their own worlds, but Julia didn't feel lost anymore. She felt present here, now, with Ethan. "Do you want to take a walk?" she asked, the idea suddenly feeling right. They weren't in any rush. The night was theirs. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful before he nodded. "A walk sounds perfect." They walked through the quiet streets, the city skyline stretching out in front of them. The noise of the world around them felt distant, like it was all happening somewhere far away. In this moment, all that mattered was the two of them, taking that one next step together. As they walked side by side, Julia realized that she didn't need to have it all figured out. She didn't need to know what the future held, because, for the first time, she felt like she could face whatever came next. With Ethan by her side, she wasn't alone. And for that, she was grateful. The choice. The walk through the city was exactly what Julia needed. The crisp night air had a way of clearing her mind, and as she walked beside Ethan, she realized how much she had been holding in. The city, bustling with life, felt like a distant hum in the background. In this moment, with Ethan at her side, it was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, walking without hurry, without expectation. The uncertainty of what lay ahead didn't feel as overwhelming now. They wandered through quiet streets, side by side, neither of them speaking at first, just taking in the peace of the night. It was rare for Julia to take time to simply be. Her life, before the cabin, had been defined by deadlines, meetings, and expectations. But now, she was beginning to see the value of slowing down, of stepping outside the routine. "What's on your mind?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, his tone gentle but curious. Julia paused for a moment, glancing up at the tall buildings around them, their lights casting shadows across the street. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. About what comes next." Ethan stopped walking too, turning to face her. "And what's next?" She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. She knew it wasn't an easy question. "I'm not sure. But I do know that I can't just go back to how things were. I can't just return to the person I was before all of this." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "I can't pretend anymore." Ethan studied her face for a moment, his eyes soft but searching, as though trying to understand what she was saying. "You don't have to pretend, Julia. You don't have to go back to anything. You've changed. And maybe that's a good thing. I've spent so long building my life around what I was supposed to be. Around what I thought was expected of me," Julia continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But being with you, it's shown me that there's more to life than that. There's more to me than that. I don't want to keep living in a way that isn't authentic, and I'm afraid that when we go back, I won't be able to hold on to what I've found." Ethan stepped closer, his presence solid and comforting. "You don't have to hold on to it, Julia. It's part of you now. The person you've become this weekend, the person who's willing to take a chance she's still here. It's not about holding on to something. It's about living it, being it." Julia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle inside her. She had been afraid of change, afraid of stepping outside the life she had created, even if that life wasn't entirely hers. But now, standing here with Ethan, she realized that maybe she didn't have to choose between the life she had and the one she wanted. Maybe she could build something new, something that blended both. "I guess what I'm really asking," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is whether you think we can make this work. Between us, I mean." Ethan's eyes softened, and he reached out to gently take her hand. "I don't know what the future holds, Julia. I'm not going to make any promises I can't keep. But I do know this. I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take that step with you, wherever it leads." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had always been afraid of the unknown, but now, standing here with him, she realized that the unknown wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. She didn't have all the answers, and neither did Ethan, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the beauty of this moment was that they didn't need to know everything. They just needed to be willing to take that first step together. "I'm scared, Ethan," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I'm scared of what it will mean to bring this into my real life. The office, the expectations, everything that has always been there. I don't know if I can keep it all together." Ethan squeezed her hand, his touch warm and steady. "We don't have to do it all at once. We can take it slow, figure it out as we go. You don't have to have everything figured out, Julia. Just take one step at a time." She looked at him, her heart swelling with something that felt like hope. For the first time in a long time, Julia didn't feel alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of her decisions by herself. They were in this together. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling too small for the gratitude she felt in her chest. "For being patient with me, for not rushing me." Ethan smiled, the expression softening the lines of tension that had always been there. "You don't have to thank me. We're figuring this out together." Julia took a deep breath, her mind finally starting to settle. The uncertainty was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy now. With Ethan beside her, the unknown didn't seem so intimidating. Whatever happened when they went back to the office, whatever pressures and challenges awaited them, they would face it together. That was all she needed to know. "So, what do we do now?" Julia asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Ethan grinned. "Now? We just keep walking." And so they did. They continued their walk through the city streets, their hands intertwined, the world around them bustling with life. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. And for the first time, in a long time, that was enough. Together, they would figure it out. One step at a time. Embracing the future. The weeks that followed their walk through the city seemed to pass in a blur. Julia found herself navigating the busy rhythms of work, but something had shifted inside her. The pressure that had once weighed so heavily on her, the constant stress of meeting expectations and being someone she wasn't sure she wanted to be, had started to loosen. It wasn't that the challenges disappeared, they were still very much there. But now she was facing them with a new perspective. Ethan had been the anchor she didn't know she needed. They hadn't rushed back into the intensity of their relationship, but rather, they had taken things slow. Casual texts, quiet dinners after work, the occasional lunch at a cafe, each step felt like it was leading them somewhere deeper, something real. The connection they had built in that cabin, amid the snow and the quiet, hadn't faded. It had only grown, subtly, in the spaces between their busy lives. In the office, Julia's approach had subtly shifted. She didn't bury herself in work the way she used to. She still took her job seriously, but she had learned to create space for herself, to allow her thoughts and feelings to exist outside of just the grind of the day-to-day. She was beginning to carve out time for things that mattered, things beyond just the office. Her heart wasn't tied up in every email, every project, and that felt like a freedom she hadn't known she needed. Ethan had been in and out of meetings all week, but their time together hadn't diminished. They continued to check in with each other, small moments where their bond felt solid and unwavering. She could tell he was still navigating the same balance of professional life and the new dynamic between them, but neither of them was rushing. The storm that had brought them together wasn't something that could be forgotten, but it was a part of their past now, something they had moved beyond yet. They were still connected by it, stronger than before. One Friday evening, after another long week, Julia received a message from Ethan asking her to meet him after work. The text was simple, but she felt the familiar flutter in her chest when she read it. They had kept things light, easy, but the more time they spent together, the more she found herself hoping for something deeper, something more. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to ask for it yet. She arrived at the cafe they had frequented, the one with the little table by the window where they had first talked for hours, laughing and sharing stories. She saw Ethan seated in their usual spot, his eyes already searching for her. As soon as he saw her, a smile broke across his face, and it felt like the weight of the past few days melted away. He stood up, his gaze warm, welcoming. "You're late," Ethan teased, but his voice was light, playful. Julia smiled, shrugging as she sat down. "Blame the traffic. You know how it is." "I'll blame the traffic, but I was starting to think you forgot about me," he said with a grin. "I could never forget about you," she said, her voice a little more serious than the moment called for. Her heart was beating faster now, like something inside her was waking up, something she had kept quiet for a while. She didn't know if it was nerves or excitement, but in that moment, she knew she had to speak the truth. Ethan raised an eyebrow, noticing the shift in her tone. "What's going on, Julia?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what's happening between us. And I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared because I'm not used to feeling this way. I'm not used to letting someone in like this, and it's all starting to feel real." Ethan's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. "I get it. I know what you mean. I've been thinking about it too." "I don't want to rush anything," Julia said quickly. "But I also don't want to keep pretending that this isn't something important, that you aren't important." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand gently. His touch felt reassuring, steady. "You don't have to rush anything, Julia, and you don't have to pretend. I feel the same way. What we have, it's real. I know it, and I think you know it too. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to keep going. Together." Julia's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she felt the weight of everything she had been carrying. She had spent so much time holding back, not letting anyone get too close. But with Ethan, it was different. She realized that she didn't need to hold herself back anymore. She could let herself feel, let herself be seen. And for the first time, she wanted to take that step, fully and completely. "I'm ready," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I'm ready to see where this goes, wherever it takes us." Ethan squeezed her hand, his smile softening into something that felt like relief. "So am I. We'll take it one step at a time, but we'll do it together." As they sat there, holding hands, Julia felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about Ethan, it was about her. She was finally letting herself embrace the uncertainty, knowing that it wasn't something to fear, but something to explore. The future still held its unknowns, but with Ethan by her side, the path forward didn't seem so intimidating. Together, they would face whatever came next, not as individuals, but as two people who had learned to trust, to open up, and to embrace what life had to offer. And in that moment, Julia knew that no matter what happened, she would never be the same. She was finally allowing herself to be who she was meant to be, and she had Ethan to thank for that. Together, they would navigate the road ahead, and that felt like enough. The key message from this story is the importance of embracing vulnerability and stepping outside of our comfort zones to build meaningful connections. Julia's journey is a powerful reminder that true growth comes from allowing ourselves to feel, to be open, and to trust others, even when it feels uncertain. We often spend so much of our lives hiding behind roles or expectations, afraid to take risks and afraid of being hurt. But true connection and fulfillment come when we let go of the need to control every aspect of our lives. It's about letting go of the fear of the unknown and embracing the journey, trusting that we don't need all the answers to take the first step. Whether in relationships, career, or personal growth, the lesson is clear. Real change happens when we allow ourselves to experience life fully, with all its challenges and uncertainties. Life is not about avoiding discomfort, but about moving through it with resilience, knowing that each step, no matter how uncertain, brings us closer to becoming the person we are meant to be. As the weekend came to an end, neither of them could have predicted how much they had changed. What started as a forced, awkward situation had become a moment of understanding of two people who had found something in each other that neither expected. The journey back to their reality wasn't easy. They both carried the weight of what had happened, knowing that the future would never be quite the same. But there was a quiet certainty between them now. They had shared something real, something honest, and it wasn't something either of them could walk away from. As they faced the world outside, both of them knew that no matter where life took them, they would always have this moment. And sometimes, that's all we really need to have something real, something worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Stories TH for more amazing stories. Also, share where you're watching from and what time it is in your area. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take a deep breath and remember, sometimes the most unexpected moments can change everything. So take your time and walk your path one step at a time.